The morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds of the Royal Military Academy as Captain Marcus Chen adjusted his grip on the practice sword. At 35, he was older than most of the fresh-faced cadets surrounding him, but his steady hands and calm demeanor had earned him respect among both students and instructors. What they didn't know was that Marcus carried a burden heavier than any weapon, the memory of a promise made to his dying mentor 15 years ago. Marcus had grown up in the mountain villages where old stories still held power. His grandfather, a weathered man with scars that told tales of battles fought in distant lands, had spoken often of the ancient pact between humans and the great WYRMS that ruled the high peaks. Dragons don't yield to strength alone, the old man would say, polishing his ceremonial blade that had been passed down through generations. They yield to honor, to courage that burns brighter than their own flames. The Academy's commandant, General Harrison, watched Marcus from across the yard. Harrison had served with Marcus's mentor, Colonel William Drake, and had personally recruited Marcus after witnessing his exceptional skill during the border conflicts. What impressed Harrison most wasn't Marcus's swordsmanship, though it was formidable, but his ability to remain calm under pressure and inspire confidence in others. "Chen, front and center," Harrison called out. Marcus approached, his boots clicking against the stone courtyard. Around them, cadets paused their training to listen. "We've received disturbing reports from the Northern Territories. Merchant caravans going missing, livestock disappearing, and witnesses claiming to have seen something massive in the skies." Marcus felt his blood chill. He had been expecting this day for years, hoping it would never come. The stories his grandfather told weren't just folklore, they were warnings. The ancient treaty between the mountain clans and the dragon lords had been broken, and now the consequences were beginning to unfold. "Sir, what kind of response are we considering?" Marcus asked, though he already suspected the answer would be insufficient. "The king wants a full military expedition. 3 companies, heavy artillery, the works," Harrison replied, his weathered face showing concern. "But between you and me, Chen, I don't think conventional tactics will work against what we're dealing with." That evening, Marcus sat in his modest quarters, holding the letter his grandfather had given him before his death. The paper was yellowed with age, written in the old script that few could still read. It contained instructions for a ritual that his family had guarded for generations, the proper way to challenge a dragon lord according to the ancient customs. His roommate, Lieutenant James Morrison, noticed Marcus's troubled expression. Morrison was a decade younger, full of enthusiasm for military life and eager to prove himself in combat. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Marcus. What's eating at you?" Marcus considered sharing the truth but decided against it. Morrison was a good soldier and a loyal friend, but some knowledge carried too much weight for unprepared shoulders. "Just thinking about the mission ahead. The Northern Territories are dangerous even without whatever's been terrorizing the locals." "Come on, it's probably just a rogue wyvern or maybe bandits using fear tactics," Morrison said with a grin. "Nothing the Royal Army can't handle. Besides, you're the best swordsman in the academy. I've seen you take down 5 opponents at once during training." Marcus smiled despite his concerns. Morrison's confidence was infectious, even if it was based on incomplete understanding of what they might face. "Let's hope you're right, James. Get some rest. We deploy at dawn." The next morning, the expedition assembled in the courtyard. 3 companies of the kingdom's finest soldiers, led by Colonel Matthews, a veteran of numerous campaigns. Marcus had been assigned as the tactical advisor, a role that would keep him close to the command structure while allowing him to observe and adapt as situations developed. As they marched north through familiar countryside, Marcus found himself remembering his grandfather's stories with new intensity. The old man had fought alongside Colonel Drake in the last great conflict, when a young dragon had violated the ancient boundaries and threatened the lowland settlements. Drake had challenged the beast according to the old ways, and the confrontation had ended without bloodshed, though both participants carried scars from the encounter. "The blade is just a symbol," his grandfather had explained. "What matters is the spirit behind it. Dragons respect courage above all else, but they can sense the difference between bravery and foolishness." The mountain passes grew steeper as they traveled, and the air became thin and cold. On the 3rd day, they encountered their first real evidence of the threat they faced. A merchant caravan had been found completely destroyed, not by bandits or wild animals, but by something that had melted steel and stone with impossible heat. Colonel Matthews examined the scene with growing unease. "I've never seen destruction like this. What kind of weapon could cause this level of devastation?" Marcus knelt beside the twisted remains of a wagon wheel, noting the distinctive pattern of the damage. His grandfather had shown him similar marks on ancient battlefields, explaining how dragon fire differed from ordinary flame. "Sir, I believe we're dealing with something beyond conventional military threats." "Meaning what exactly, Captain?" Matthews demanded, his patience wearing thin under the stress of command. "Meaning we need to reconsider our approach. Direct confrontation might not be the wisest course of action." That night, as the expedition made camp in a defensible valley, Marcus walked the perimeter and studied the high peaks surrounding them. Somewhere up there, an ancient intelligence was watching and waiting. The dragon lords had awakened from their long sleep, and humanity was about to rediscover why their ancestors had treated these creatures with such careful respect. Morrison found him standing watch near the edge of camp. "You've been quiet since we found that caravan. This is getting to you more than usual." Marcus turned to his friend, weighing his words carefully. "James, what do you know about the old stories? The ones about dragons and the mountain clans?" "Fairy tales mostly." "Why do you ask?" "Sometimes fairy tales carry more truth than we realize." Marcus pointed toward the highest peak, where strange lights flickered against the night sky. "Tomorrow we'll reach the heart of their territory. I want you to stay close to me, and, whatever happens, follow my lead exactly." The lights in the distance pulsed with an otherworldly rhythm, and Marcus felt the weight of his grandfather's blade at his side. Soon, he would learn whether the old ways still held power, or whether humanity had forgotten too much to survive what was coming. As the expedition settled in for an uneasy night's rest, Marcus remained awake, studying the ancient letter by firelight and preparing himself for a confrontation that would test everything he had learned about courage, honor, and the delicate balance between man and monster. In the morning, they would continue their march toward destiny, unaware that their fate would ultimately rest not on superior numbers or advanced weapons, but on one man's willingness to lift his blade in the proper spirit of challenge. The wind carried strange scents down from the peaks, sulfur and smoke mixed with something older and wilder. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to remember every detail of his grandfather's teachings, knowing that tomorrow would bring the greatest test of his life, and possibly his last chance to honor the promise he had made to a dying mentor so many years ago. The fourth day of their march brought them to the ruins of an ancient watchtower, its stones blackened and partially melted. Colonel Matthews called for a halt while scouts investigated the area. Marcus used the opportunity to examine symbols carved into the surviving stonework, markings he recognized from his grandfather's journals. Lieutenant Morrison approached with a troubled expression. "The scouts found fresh tracks, Marcus. Massive ones, leading up toward Dragon's Crown Peak. Whatever made them weighs several tons at least." Marcus nodded grimly. Dragon's Crown was exactly where his grandfather's maps indicated the oldest lair would be located. "James, I need you to do something for me. When we reach the base of that peak, I want you to convince Colonel Matthews to make camp and wait." "Wait for what?" "For me to return." Morrison stared at his friend with growing alarm. "Marcus, you're talking like you're planning something suicidal." "What aren't you telling me?" Before Marcus could respond, a shadow passed overhead, massive enough to block out the afternoon sun. Every soldier in the expedition looked up simultaneously, and several cried out in shock. The creature circling above them was enormous, its wingspan easily exceeding 100 feet. Scales that seemed to shift between gold and crimson caught the light as it wheeled through the air with predatory grace. Colonel Matthews shouted orders for defensive positions, but his voice carried an edge of panic. The dragon made no aggressive moves, simply circling at a distance that kept it well beyond arrow range while making its presence unmistakably clear. "It's watching us," Sergeant Williams whispered to his squad. "Like it's deciding whether we're worth the trouble." Marcus felt a strange mixture of fear and familiarity as he observed the great WIRM. This was likely Pyraxus, the eldest of the mountain lords, whose territory they had now officially entered. According to his grandfather's notes, Pyraxus was ancient beyond human comprehension, having witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms across centuries. The dragon completed several more circles before settling on a high ledge where its massive form remained clearly visible to the expedition below. It tucked its wings against its body and appeared to be waiting for something, its intelligent eyes never leaving the human forces. "Sir," Marcus addressed Colonel Matthews, "I believe it wants to communicate."
"Dragons don't communicate, Captain. They destroy, devour, and dominate. That's what dragons do."
Marcus shook his head.
"With respect, sir, that's what we've been taught to believe.
But the old records tell a different story. Dragons are intelligent beings with their own codes of honor and conduct." Matthews looked at Marcus as if he had lost his mind.
"Are you suggesting we attempt to negotiate with that monster?"
"I'm suggesting we follow protocols that predate our current military doctrine by several centuries."
Marcus pulled out his grandfather's letter, now worn from constant handling.
"Sir, my family has maintained certain traditions regarding interactions with the Dragon Lords. If you'll allow me, I'd like to attempt contact according to those ancient customs." The dragon's head turned toward their group, and Marcus felt certain it was listening to their conversation despite the distance.
Dragons possessed hearing far superior to humans, and Pyraxus likely understood every word being spoken. Morrison grabbed Marcus's arm. "This is insane.
You're talking about walking up to a creature that could incinerate you before you took 10 steps.
Not walking, James.
The approach must be made on horseback, alone, carrying specific traditional items." Marcus began removing equipment from his pack, revealing items he had kept hidden throughout the journey. A ceremonial horn made from ancient bone, a banner bearing symbols that predated the current kingdom, and, most importantly, his grandfather's sword in its ornate scabbard. Colonel Matthews studied the items with growing fascination.
"Where did you acquire these artifacts, Captain?" "They've been in my family for generations, sir. Passed down from the time when our ancestors served as intermediaries between the Dragon Lords and human settlements." "You're telling me your family were dragon diplomats?" Matthews asked incredulously. "Something like that."
Marcus began donning ceremonial armor that had been carefully maintained despite its age. The position carried great honor and even greater risk.
Not many families were willing to take on the responsibility.
As Marcus prepared his gear, the dragon shifted position on its perch, and its massive head tilted in what appeared to be recognition. Pyraxus had seen these preparations before, perhaps centuries ago, and understood their significance. "The ritual requires that I approach alone," Marcus explained to the gathered officers.
"Any attempt to follow or provide support will be interpreted as a violation of the ancient protocols and could result in immediate attack." "Absolutely not," Matthews declared.
"I won't send one of my officers on a suicide mission based on folklore and family legends." Marcus straightened, meeting the colonel's gaze steadily. "Sir, with all due respect, our conventional weapons are useless against a creature of that size and power. Our only chance of resolving this situation without massive casualties lies in following the old ways." Before Matthews could respond, the dragon released a thunderous roar that echoed across the valley. The sound was not aggressive, but rather seemed to carry a note of impatience. Several horses reared in terror, and even seasoned veterans took involuntary steps backward. Sergeant Williams, who had served in border conflicts for over 20 years, spoke up quietly. "Sir, I've seen what modern weapons do to flesh and blood enemies. But that thing up there isn't made of anything we know how to fight." Matthews looked around at his troops, seeing fear in faces that had remained steady through countless battles. The dragon's presence was having a psychological effect that went beyond rational military assessment.
"All right, Captain," Matthews said finally. "But you're not going alone."
"I'll position marksmen at maximum range. If that creature makes any aggressive move toward you, we'll provide covering fire for your retreat." Marcus nodded, though he knew that if Pyraxus decided to attack, no amount of covering fire would make any difference. He mounted his horse, a steady mare that seemed remarkably calm given the circumstances, and secured his grandfather's banner to his lance. "Remember," he told Morrison, "if I don't return by sunset, do not attempt a rescue. Withdraw to the valley entrance and send word to the capital about what you've witnessed here."
"Marcus," Morrison said urgently, "what am I supposed to tell them? That you rode off to have a chat with a dragon?"
"Tell them that Captain Marcus Chen attempted to honor the ancient covenant between his family and the Dragon Lords. Tell them whether he succeeded or failed." Marcus guided his horse toward the narrow path that led up to Pyraxus's perch.
"And, James?"
"Tell them that sometimes the old ways are the only ways that matter." As he began his solitary ascent, Marcus could feel the weight of centuries pressing down upon him. His grandfather's voice seemed to whisper in his ear, reminding him of the proper words to speak, the correct posture to maintain, and the delicate balance between showing respect and demonstrating courage. The dragon watched his approach with unblinking golden eyes, its massive form radiating both power and intelligence. Marcus realized that Pyraxus was evaluating not just his actions, but his intentions, his character, and his worthiness to carry on a tradition that had kept peace between their peoples for generations. Behind him, the expedition waited in tense silence, their fate now resting in the hands of one man and his willingness to trust in wisdom older than their kingdom itself. The afternoon sun beat down on ancient stones as Marcus Chen rode toward a confrontation that would determine whether humanity still possessed the honor to stand before dragons as equals rather than merely as prey. The wind carried the scent of sulfur and smoke, but also something else, the faint trace of recognition, as if the mountain itself remembered when such meetings had been common rather than legendary. Pyraxus shifted slightly, extending one massive wing in what Marcus hoped was a gesture of acknowledgement rather than preparation for attack. As he drew closer, Marcus began to understand why his grandfather had spoken of dragons with such profound respect mixed with careful wariness. The intelligence behind those golden eyes was vast and ancient, carrying memories that span centuries and wisdom earned through experiences no human could imagine. This was not merely a powerful beast, but a being whose very existence challenged humanity to rise above its basest instincts and prove itself worthy of sharing the world with such magnificent creatures. Marcus dismounted 50 feet from the great dragon, his hands steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Pyraxus towered above him, each scale larger than a dinner plate, eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of centuries fixed upon this single human who dared approach according to the ancient customs. Following his grandfather's precise instructions, Marcus planted the ceremonial banner in the rocky ground and withdrew the horn from his pack. The bone instrument was older than his family's written records, carved with symbols that predated any known script. When he raised it to his lips and blew, the sound that emerged was deep and resonant, echoing off the mountain peaks with haunting clarity. The dragon's massive head tilted at the first notes. Recognition flickered in those golden eyes, followed by something that might have been surprise. Pyraxus had not heard the formal challenge horn for over 2 centuries, not since the last treaty keeper had died without properly passing on the traditions to his descendants. Marcus lowered the horn and began speaking in the old language, words his grandfather had made him memorize phonetically since no living human truly understood their full meaning anymore. "Great Pyraxus, Lord of the High Peaks, I come as Marcus Chen, heir to the line of treaty keepers, bearing the blade of my ancestors and seeking audience according to the ancient customs." The dragon's response came not as words, but as a presence in Marcus's mind, a form of communication that transcended human language. Images flowed through his consciousness, the signing of the original treaty centuries ago, his ancestors standing before dragon lords with the same ceremonial weapons, and the gradual abandonment of the old ways as humanity grew confident in its technological superiority. Marcus felt Pyraxus's disappointment at humanity's forgetfulness, but also curiosity about this unexpected renewal of ancient protocols. The Dragon Lord had watched the military expeditions approach with resignation, expecting another pointless conflict that would end in human casualties and further deterioration of the ancient understanding between their peoples. "I seek to understand why the covenant has been broken," Marcus continued, drawing his grandfather's sword and holding it across both palms in the traditional gesture of respectful challenge. "The borderlands suffer, and both our peoples pay the price for forgotten wisdom." Pyraxus shifted, lowering his enormous head until his eyes were level with Marcus's position. The mental communication intensified, and Marcus experienced a flood of images and sensations that nearly overwhelmed his human consciousness. He saw through the dragon's eyes as human settlements expanded into territories that had been set aside as neutral ground. Mining operations had disturbed ancient rest sites where dragon lords had slumbered for decades at a time. Worst of all, young dragons had been hunted by trophy seekers who viewed them as mere beasts rather than intelligent beings deserving of respect. The attacks on human settlements had not been random acts of aggression, but responses to these violations of the ancient boundaries. Pyraxis and the other dragon lords had attempted to send warnings through traditional channels, but humanity had forgotten how to recognize or interpret such communications. Marcus felt the weight of his people's ignorance pressing down upon him. Great Lord, the knowledge has been lost. Most humans no longer remember the old agreements or understand their significance. Pyraxis's response carried both sadness and a glimmer of hope. The Dragon Lord had lived through similar periods of human forgetfulness before, but, always eventually, someone had emerged to restore the proper relationships. The fact that Marcus stood before him now, carrying the correct ceremonial items and speaking the ancient words, suggested that perhaps the covenant could be renewed rather than permanently severed. But renewal would require more than memory and good intentions. It would require proof that humanity still possessed the courage and honor that had made the original treaty possible. Pyraxis communicated the terms of the ancient challenge: single combat between the human treatykeeper and the Dragon Lord, fought according to rules that tested valor rather than merely determining victory. The dragon would not use his full strength or advantages, but neither would he hold back enough to make the contest meaningless. Marcus understood immediately. This was not about winning or losing in any conventional sense. It was about demonstrating that humanity still contained individuals worthy of respect, people willing to risk everything to honor agreements made by their ancestors. He raised his grandfather's sword, feeling the weight of its history and the responsibility it carried. The blade had been forged specifically for such challenges, tempered with techniques lost to modern smiths and blessed according to rituals that predated organized religion. I accept the challenge, Lord Pyraxis, in the name of my lineage and for the hope of renewed understanding between our peoples. The dragon rose to his full height, an awe-inspiring sight that would have sent most humans fleeing in terror. But Marcus held his ground, drawing strength from the certainty that his grandfather had faced similar moments and survived to pass on the tradition. Pyraxis began the ritual combat slowly, testing Marcus's reflexes and resolve. A massive claw swept toward him with carefully controlled force, enough to be genuinely dangerous, but not enough to ensure death if the human showed proper skill and courage. Marcus rolled beneath the sweep, his grandfather's training taking over as conscious thought became impossible under such intense pressure. He struck out with his sword, not aiming to wound but to demonstrate his willingness to engage fully despite the overwhelming disparity in size and power. The blade connected with Pyraxis's scales, producing a shower of sparks but no damage. The Dragon Lord rumbled with what Marcus realized was approval rather than pain. The human was showing proper spirit, neither cowering in terror nor attacking with suicidal recklessness. For 20 minutes, the ritual combat continued. Marcus dodged and weaved between attacks that could have crushed him instantly if delivered with full force. His sword work was precise and determined, each strike placed to show skill rather than cause harm. Sweat poured down his face as exhaustion began to take its toll, but his movements never lost their disciplined control. Finally, Pyraxis stepped back and lowered his great head in a gesture of formal acknowledgement. The challenge had been completed according to the ancient requirements. Marcus had proven that his people still possessed individuals capable of facing dragons with courage and honor rather than merely hatred and fear. The mental communication resumed, but now it carried warmth instead of wariness. Pyraxis was prepared to discuss renewal of the covenant, but first he wanted to understand how much of the old knowledge could be recovered and whether Marcus had the authority to speak for his people. Marcus explained his position within the military hierarchy and his connection to the royal court through General Harrison. He admitted honestly that most humans would find the ancient agreements difficult to understand or accept, but argued that the alternative was continued conflict that would benefit no one. Pyraxis shared memories of previous renewals, showing Marcus how such negotiations had been conducted in the past. The process would require formal recognition from human leadership, establishment of new neutral zones to replace those that had been violated, and, most importantly, identification and training of new treaty keepers to maintain ongoing communication between the peoples. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Marcus realized that his successful completion of the ritual challenge was only the beginning of a much larger process. He had proven humanity's worthiness to negotiate, but now the real work would begin, convincing his own people to embrace agreements that would limit their expansion and require them to acknowledge dragons as equals rather than monsters to be eliminated. "I will carry your words to my leaders, great lord," Marcus promised, sheathing his sword and preparing to depart. "But I cannot guarantee their reception. Many humans have forgotten how to listen to wisdom that comes from outside their own kind." Pyraxus's final communication was both warning and encouragement. If humanity proved unable to honor renewed agreements, the Dragon Lords would be forced to take more decisive action to protect their territory and young. But, if proper understanding could be restored, both peoples might find ways to coexist that would benefit everyone. As Marcus rode back down the mountain path toward the waiting expedition, he carried with him knowledge that would reshape human understanding of their relationship with the dragons. The ancient covenant could indeed be renewed, but only if his people possessed the wisdom to recognize that true strength sometimes required yielding to greater forces rather than simply challenging them. Behind him, Pyraxus watched until the human figure disappeared from view, then spread his massive wings and took flight toward the highest peaks where the other dragon lords waited to hear the results of this unexpected renewal of ancient traditions. The man had lifted his blade with proper honor and courage. Now it remained to be seen whether his people would prove equally worthy of the respect they sought to earn through his actions. The expedition below waited nervously as Marcus approached, their relief at his safe return mixed with curiosity about what had transpired during his lengthy audience with the great dragon. The real test of his success would come not in his survival, but in his ability to convince others that sometimes the old ways offered solutions that modern thinking could not achieve. The sun set behind Dragon's Crown Peak as Marcus Chen prepared to begin the most important mission of his life, teaching his own people how to yield with honor rather than fight with feudal pride against forces they could never truly defeat.